Yeah, I was actually at the space last. Cool. Is that good? Yeah. Last week in Sarah for a New York for Palestine coalition meeting, and Sarah pulled me aside and asked me if I would join all of you this evening and talk a little bit about some of the legislation that has been passing, that has been introduced and passed in several states in the U.S. and also introduced on a federal level to attack the growing movement to boycott. For boycott, divestment, and sanctions from the racist Zionist colonial state of Israel. And I will do that, but because being here and listening to the sister from Baltimore and the sister from Cuba, I feel like I need to instead talk a little bit about Arab women. Just tell you a little bit more about myself. I grew up in South Yonkers. My parents were immigrants from the Arab world in the 70s. I come from a family of Teamsters, trade unionists, factory workers. Yeah. I have been active in the New York chapter of the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, Awda, since its founding in 2000, and had been somewhat active before that as well, as from my high school years, I would say, on the Palestinian issue and anti-imperialist issues, starting actually with Central America before I found a platform to engage on issues regarding the Arab world. And I then became a teacher. I was a public school teacher in Yonkers in the Bronx for several years until I moved to Chicago and worked as a community organizer for the Arab American Action Network, where my friend Rasmia Awda also works. And I'll talk about her case for a minute. After that, I came back to New York and decided to get a law degree because so much of what we were facing in our community was connected to the law. And since getting a law degree, I've actually been working on several global labor projects. I've spent a lot of time in India. Making connections on class struggle and anti-imperialism and so on. And that was also a very sort of eye-opening experience for me. And I also lived in the Arab world, including worked as a legal worker in Egypt. And when I think about Arab women, I think about the way that I'm invited to so many spaces that are created by Western politicians and Western institutions and Western legal groups. And they always want for the Arab woman to come into the room and talk about the rights of women in the Arab world and the rights of women in the Muslim world and why women wear hijab. And we always have to stop them and say, if you care about Arab women, then you need to fight to end U.S. imperialism and empire. And, you know, as I was sitting here talking to the two sisters speak, I was thinking of an organization in Egypt called El Nadim, the Center for the Rehabilitation of Torture Victims. And that is run by a kick-ass leftist woman by the name of Awda, Adely. And what their organization does is provide legal counseling, physical and mental health counseling for victims of torture. And torture is an enormous problem in Egypt, as you know, given the the U.S. supported, funded military regime that has been in existence for too long. And people come there who have been victims of torture at the hands of the police, at the hands of the military, Secret Service, but also women. And they recognize that one of the main factors why violence against women has become such an epidemic in a place like Egypt is because of the militarization of the society, which is part of the U.S. imperialist domination of that region. And that figures into their analysis always. The liberation of women in Egypt has to start with the liberation of women from state violence, and that always goes back to U.S. support for regimes in the Arab world. And the last time I was in Egypt, I spent some time with a very good friend of mine, Isra El-Tawil, who is a student in her early 20s, who about a year and a half ago, when she was attending a rally remembering the Egyptian revolution, she was shot by military forces and is now permanently crippled. And I had seen her for the first time during my last trip in the fall, since she had been shot. And I returned back to the United States, and 2 weeks later, I hear that she disappeared. She was one of hundreds of people, men, women, students, who have disappeared from the streets of Cairo. She did turn up in a women's prison about a month later. And hers was one of several campaigns that we had internationally to support her. And she has been released, but she's still pending charges of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and supporting terrorism, etc., and importation of the Western war on terror, as is being played out in Egypt. And you know, hearing the sister from Baltimore remind us of this important narrative of white settler colonialism in the United States and the kind of violence that has bestowed on the indigenous people of the Americas and on slaves, and then continuing into all of the actions of U.S. domination throughout the Americas and then into the Middle East. And it's an extension of that white settler colonialist mentality, that violent mentality. And today, my friends and I were circulating an article that stated that since the onslaught of the war on terror, 4 million Arabs and Muslims have been killed. That number is actually much, much higher, because it doesn't take into account those that were killed in the 1990 Gulf War and the sanctions that came after that, and it doesn't take into account all those that are killed at the hands of U.S.-funded and U.S.-supported regimes, like Saudi Arabia and like Egypt. I don't know if people are aware that in the 1 year, the first year that Sisi was in power, more people were killed and imprisoned than the entire regime of Pinochet in Chile. And the situation is not much better. So we work in this country to dismantle Zionism and imperialism, and racism. And, you know, we're not always so good at doing it. I mean, we change our strategies, we come together, we form different groups, we form different coalitions, we form alliances. It's a struggle, particularly when you're in a situation where you have to react to everything that is taking place. And the reason why I was reacting is because the repression against those who were actively fighting for the liberation of Palestine and actively fighting for, you know, rights in U.S.-dominated Arab world and for the left in the Arab world and for those deemed terrorists in the Arab world, that is increasingly subjecting us to different forms of repression. But that repression, of course, is not new. You know, one of the under the Nixon administration, there was a program called Operation Boulder, which was the first program to surveil Arab Americans in the United States. And that's because in that period, when there was some kind of shift in U.S. support for Israel, when it especially strengthened in the 67 war and the 73 war, the Arab American community became much more active. And in Detroit, in the background of the movement of the Black Revolutionary Auto League, Arab workers went on strike for 2 days to demand that UAW divest from Israel. That was the first call for divestment. That was the beginning of a long line of repression going into the 80s with the LA 8 case. I don't know if you're familiar with all these cases, but I can't go into all of them in detail right now. And then all of these outrageous cases that we have seen come up now, like Sami al-Arian, the Holy Land Five, Muhammad Salah in Chicago, and they have to be, thank you, and they have to be fought on all different levels. They have to be fought legally, and they have to be fought on the ground through the movement. And one particular case that we are especially sort of concerned about and organizing around global throughout the country. I'm a member of the United States Palestine Community Network, and one of our main campaigns is in support of Suzanne Adely, who is a woman who survived torture at the hands, physical and sexual torture at the hands of Israeli Zionist colonial settlers, was exiled from her home country, comes to the United States, becomes a community leader, an important community leader, and now the country is trying to strip her of her citizenship. And we just actually won a partial victory in that case, where she is going to get a chance to defend herself in the lower court. And so we've also reached this period where the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has really grown and strengthened throughout the world, really. As I said, the workers in Detroit in the 70s were the first to call for divestment. And, there had been a lot of talk about pushing the BDS movement. I remember going to a conference in Berkeley in 2001 talking about how to do this. And I just want to be clear, though, it's also in our opinion that, BDS is a tactic. It's not the movement as a whole. And even though it takes up a lot of our time, the movement is still the holistic liberation of Palestine, including supporting all forms of resistance. That context is important, when I talk about BDS. But in recent years, there have been, the official launch for BDS that came out of Palestine was in 2005. And in recent years, there have been some outstanding, spectacular victories. Like the prison company, the fiber security company G4S, just announced divestment from Israel, and also I think from what Joe Catrone is an organizer with Awda New York, who's in the audience, who's a big part of that campaign, and I think he wrote an article in this, exactly about it. And I'm also a co-convener of Labor for Palestine, and we have also seen some amazing victories in the U.S. labor movement, which we never thought would come. The United Electrical Workers passed in their national convention, passed a very strong BDS resolution, and several local academic UAW chapters have done the same. The University of California, and we might see that coming through at NYU. It's also happened in the AFL-CIO chapter of Connecticut, and we see it growing. Conversations are happening in some of the nurses' unions and so on. So that's very promising, and there's a really, really, really long list of BDS victories, from actors to musicians to multi-million-dollar companies that have been forced to leave the settlements because of the boycott, and it's amazing. But what's happening as a result then is that over 19, maybe 20 U.S. states have proposed legislation to some extent to criminalize basically anybody engaged in boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. And all those pieces of legislation say different things, but I'll talk briefly about the New York legislation, which basically calls for making a blacklist of all individuals, organizations, and businesses that engage in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And anyone who's on that blacklist will be barred from having any business with the state, and barred from having any state pensions invested also in their businesses and so on. This is a really sort of far-reaching legislation that I don't think that they really thought that much about, because that means that they would have, what Joe was telling me before, that means that they would have to actually stop dealing with G4S, which actually functions in a lot of places in New York State. And there's also federal legislation that's also attacking supporters of BDS. But I want to just sort of end up talking about what's going on in the CUNY system, right? There are some wonderful radical students throughout the CUNY system that have taken up the cause of Palestine in the form of SJP chapters, and then one united coalition called New York City Students for Justice in Palestine. And several of them are also part of many other sort of anti-imperialist campaigns and struggles at CUNY, and also struggles to liberate CUNY from neoliberal business and politics, and keep CUNY affordable, etc. And the Zionist Organization of America sent a pretty scathing letter report to CUNY Central and to the state officials, accusing CUNY of allowing a widespread culture of anti-Semitism. And I haven't actually read the report yet, but I know that one of the things that was written in it was that allowing students to wear keffiyehs, which is our scarves, right? Which they say as being an incitement of genocide. So it's that kind of outrage, but that outrageousness has turned into now Republicans in the states in Albany basically now writing into their bill that CUNY funding will now be contingent on whether or not they can eradicate that anti-Semitism from the CUNY system. I know, right? I mean, in some ways, those of us familiar with the law are kind of, okay, you know, we got to say this, we got to do this, but we have this overall feeling that, you know, these wild pieces of legislation are so blatantly in violation of the First Amendment and the Constitution that they never really can, you know, withstand the law, right? But that doesn't stop it from creating a widespread intimidation. I mean, on a daily basis, we're getting texts from students telling us that they've been called in for meetings, for investigations, for hearings, you know, and we're trying to kind of like filter through all of that. And I think that that's really all that I really sort of need to say about that. I mean, you can ask me in question and answer, and I don't really have that much so urgent that I have to say right now, but I look forward to the discussion, and thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah. Copy of the talk that you gave tonight and anything else that you have written. You're very knowledgeable, and these conversations are important among women. I wanted to just also acknowledge, I don't think I mentioned that I'm part of the National Lawyers Guild. And I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Committee, and we've actually been very active around Cuba for over a decade on the Cuban 5 case. The current president, a good friend of mine, Natasha Bannon, and Art Heitzer in Milwaukee, who I just saw at a Cuba Solidarity event, heads up that work for the Guild. And I haven't been to Cuba yet, but I was in Venezuela in 2006 before I became a lawyer. And, you know, we continue to sort of be inspired by the movements that we have seen playing out there. And it reminds me to dream, to dream about a future while we're, you know, in the Arab world trying to fight the Islamic State. It's hard to kind of look at a future. So that's one of the reasons why we appreciate Cuba, we appreciate Venezuela. But I want to make an observation. Working in some institutions with like a new generation of radical lawyers, a new generation of activists who are like, yeah, Cuba, Venezuela. But, you know, I come to understand that particularly the newer generation don't really understand the political importance of Cuba and Venezuela and other similar places. They have a very sort of like weak understanding of socialism and anti-imperialism, and it's particularly in this Bernie era, right? And so they might listen to the older generation of activists. I'm not older or younger, but I'm kind of in between. They might listen to the older generation and be like, yeah, we'll come to Cuba with you. And in fact, National Lawyers Guild folks are right now in Honduras doing a fact-finding mission, because Berta was somebody who they were very close to. So they're very active in the Americas, and we're continuing to be very active in the Middle East now, hopefully. And I also wanted to say that all this discussion around reproductive rights reminds me also of the revelation that, the realization that Ethiopian women entering Israel have also been subjected to unwanted sterilization. And during the last Gaza war, a high-up Israeli political official made the statement that we must kill Palestinian women so that they don't give birth to little snakes. And it's the same kind of like demographic threat that these sorts of policies, white supremacist, Zionist democratic threat to these sorts of policies, thrive on. And we see them in so many formations, and it's really sort of important for us to think about how to like fight those together when the context is right and appropriate, and so on. And I'll also say that the Cuba connection is very much also in Latin America about class struggle. And while I talked about imperialism, the fact of the matter is the roots of the revolts that have been taking place in the Arab world for the past 5 years are all rooted in neoliberalism, at which state violence is used to implement. And Palestine very much is at the center of that. And if you want some books to read further into that, I have some recommendations. But I think that's a very important discussion. Now, as far as the legislation, the sponsoring New York senator was Michael Gianaris, and the co-sponsors were Martin Golden and Tony Avella. I don't know what name you mentioned. It was Tony. It was Schumer. Oh, you asked for. Oh, no, it wasn't Schumer. I knew that. Yeah. Oh, the U.S. senator. I think it was Tom. It was Kirk out of Illinois, who was who's one of the main sponsors of the federal legislation. I had looked up the New York legislation. Okay, and then just the question about how to fight this. Well, I think like anything else, when we have to fight in any realm possible, and there are a lot of people who are now engaged in lobbying and engaging, it's not my thing, but educating people around what's going on and fighting on the campuses, fighting in the unions. I do know the Boston bus drivers struggle, which I think was amazing, and just continuing what we need to do despite these tactics of intimidation. So, thank you.